There we go. Okay, so thank you again, Allie Hansen, Communications Manager for the Oregon Department of State Lands, and I'll be your moderator. Welcome, everybody. Development of a habitat conservation plan is essential to the Land Board's vision for the Elliott and to protecting and enhancing habitat for endangered and threatened species. So it's very exciting to have a working draft ready to share. Tonight's agenda is pretty straightforward. We're going to do a presentation on the working draft of the Elliott HCP, followed by plenty of time for questions and discussion. I will ask that you hold your questions and your thoughts till after the presentation. If you've got a question about something specific, we'll be able to go back to that slide. We are going to use the raise hand feature to take questions. So feel free anytime during the presentation to raise your hand to join the queue. If you're on the phone, it's *9 to raise your hand. If you have a technical question or a problem, feel free to chat me directly. And at this point, I know we're all very good at Zoom, but please do remember to keep yourselves muted. Okay, any questions about the agenda or meeting logistics? All right, seeing none, I'm going to turn the floor over to Trey Ramik from ICF, who's working with DSL and OSU to develop the Habitat Conservation Plan. Troy, please take it away.
Thanks, Ellie, and hi, everyone. I'm Troy Ramik with ICF. I'm the project manager for the HCP technical team. My firm was retained a couple of years ago by DSL to work on the Habitat Conservation Plan, and we've been working along the process ever since then. I'm going to just reiterate a couple of things that Ali mentioned. One is we're going to go through, it's probably about a half an hour of presentation tonight, and then we'll take plenty of questions after that. We can revisit any of the slides at any point during the question and answer period. And then also, you'll notice as we go through, there are many slides that have a lot of words on them, and that's on purpose because not only will the recording be available after the fact, we'll make the slide deck available so you can revisit any of the information that we're presenting. So I say that just so that if you are, taking screenshots or taking notes feverishly throughout, just note that you will get the presentation. So maybe it'll save you a little bit of time there. So the plan for tonight for the presentation is to give a little bit of a brief overview of what habitat conservation plans are. Why are we doing this in the first place? Talk specifically about the scope of this habitat conservation plan for the Elliott State Research Forest, and then spend some time highlighting a few things that are in the working draft HCP that is now available on the DSL website. So diving in, habitat conservation plans, for those of you who are new to this process or haven't been involved in one of these processes before, essentially a habitat conservation plan, or an HCP as we sometimes shorten it, outlines how an entity will comply with the Federal Endangered Species Act. Now, of course, this is only done if there are listed species present in an area where somebody is doing project activities. And the habitat conservation plan really is completed to support the application for a Section 10 incidental take permit under the Endangered Species Act. And I'll talk a little bit more about the federal agencies that are involved in the process in a second. The incidental take permit in this case is intended to provide certainty over the long term. For example, as the research forest is being implemented over the long term, obviously we know that there are some threatened and endangered species on the Elliott now, and there will be those species will continue to persist into the future. So there needs to be some certainty about how activities can occur over the long term. And at the same time, it builds certainty into the process for how conservation will be attained on the forest over time. So it really provides certainty in a couple of different ways, which is why Department of State Lands and OSU are interested in it at this stage. The HCP itself, along with the federal permits that eventually come down the road, will define how the activities that are covered by the permits will occur on the forest and set some goals and objectives for how conservation will be achieved on the forest. And I'll explain more of that later as well. There are two federal agencies involved in the process, and I mentioned that the Habitat Conservation Plan is really meant to support an application for permits under the Endangered Species Act. And those permits actually come from both the National Marine Fisheries Service, who has jurisdiction over marine and most anadromous fish species, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which has jurisdiction over terrestrial and freshwater aquatic species. And in this case, um, we are proposing to obtain permits for the Oregon Coast coho, you see there on the lower left, which is under the jurisdiction of NOAA Fisheries, the National Marine Fisheries Service, and Northern Spotted Owl and Marbled Marulette, which are under the jurisdiction of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So when we talk about the HCP and permits, there really are two permits, and those permits are issued for these individual species, which I'll explain more about. So now let's talk a little bit about the scope of this particular habitat conservation plan. And when I say the scope of the habitat conservation plan, I really mean these four things. So the permit area, or where do the permits apply? The permit term, how long will the permits be in place for? The covered activities, what activities are we getting permits for in this case? And then the covered species, what species are addressed by the habitat conservation plan? Let me walk through each of those in a little bit more detail just to explain what the scope of this HCP is. So first of all, the permit area and permit term. The permit area in this case is the same as the common school lands that are included in the Elliott State Forest. So you can see in the image here on the screen, the area that is essentially kind of a turquoise greenish color. Those are the common school lands, and those are the areas that we call the permit area for the Elliott State Research Forest, HCP. You'll notice that there are some Board of Forestry lands, Oregon Board of Forestry lands around the edges and even internal to the Elliott. Those are shown in yellow here on the screen. Those lands are not included in this Elliott State Research Forest HCP. They're actually covered by the Western Oregon State Forest HCP that ODF is doing, which is a separate process. I pointed out here because they are in some ways integral to the Elliott, and so it's important to know how the permits, different permits apply or will apply to different parts of the Elliott, but also that in the future, if land exchanges occur, in this case between a DSL and Oregon Department of Forestry, there would be permit coverage for whoever has ownership and management responsibility for the land at that point in time. So both HCPs actually contemplate the potential for that to occur in the future. So I wanted to highlight that. And then as far as the permit term, there's no real, I guess, like definitive permit term for habitat conservation plans. They can be anywhere from 6 months or a year all the way up to, I think the longest one ever written was for maybe 99 years. In this case, we are proposing an 80-year permit term. And the reason why 80 years is being proposed at this time is because we know that the covered activities that we're looking at covering will be occurring long into the future, actually even longer than 80 years. But we're also thinking about how long will it take to see meaningful conservation on the forest. And being a forested landscape, sometimes that that takes time. It takes time for forests to develop into different stages of habitat for our covered species. And so 80-year permit term is really a nice balance between providing long-term certainty for how those covered activities can occur on the landscape and long-term conservation certainty for what we're getting for our covered species. The activities that are being covered by this HCP, and I'm not going to go into great detail, but we can follow up with more during the Q&A if people have specific questions about this. But essentially, we're covering the implementation of the Elliott State Research Forest design, the allocations that go along with that design. And if you have been following this process over the last couple of years, you will know that there are basically kind of 4 different designations within that design. There are the reserves, both the blocked and scattered. So the blocked reserves, like the Conservation Research Watershed, and I'll show you an image of that in a second. And then the reserves that are in the Management Research Watershed portion of the forest. There's the intensive allocations, which are areas that are less than 65 years old and will be managed in more an intensive forestry method, and then extensive allocations, which will be managed more in line with sort of ecological forestry. And then there's the riparian conservation areas. These are essentially riparian buffers that are around rivers and streams across the entire Elliott State Research Forest, and areas that are designated to have management that align with developing higher quality riparian and aquatic habitat over the long term. And I'll explain how that relates to our covered species in a later slide. Now, in order to actually implement this research design, there also has to be, of course, some, supporting management activities and supporting infrastructure. So things like vegetation management or the road system, other facilities, research facilities, recreation facilities, all of those things will need to be, maintained, or in some cases, some new facilities will need to be built in order to fully implement the research design. So those are contemplated as covered activities as well. And then this is really what it looks like, and many of you have probably seen some version of this before, but essentially what you're looking at here is the research allocations as they lay out across the Elliott. On the left-hand side of the screen, this kind of orange color is the conservation research watershed that I mentioned. On the right-hand side, the multicolored portion is the management research watersheds, which include include reserves, intensive treatments, extensive treatments. And then you can also see on this slide the riparian conservation areas, which apply across the entire forest. So those show up in a couple of different colors depending on where they fall on this schematic. It's important to think about this and kind of keep this image in your mind as we move through the rest of the presentation, because the crux of what we're doing in the HCP is basically thinking about this layout, these research allocations, and how do they overlay and intersect with our understanding of our 3 covered species on the Elliott. So we'll be asking the core question, when we implement these activities on the landscape over the next 80 years, what are the potential effects that they could have on those species, and then what minimization and or mitigation measures need to be put in place to offset the potential for take to occur under the Endangered Species Act. I'll mention these species just one more time. So, these are the 3 species that we're proposing to get coverage for under the HCP. And one thing I wanted to highlight with this slide is that in the HCP, if you've taken a look at the version that is on the DSL website, you'll notice that pretty much everything in the HCP is written, sort of through the lens of covered species. Everything we do is in the service of covered species in the HCP is very much a species-centric plan. And so there are independent analyses for each of these 3 species that kind of run throughout the HCP. You'll see us treat each species kind of multiple times for multiple reasons in different chapters. And that really is because at the end of the day, we are providing the habitat conservation plan to the 2 federal agencies in pursuit of these incidental take permits, and those incidental take permits are for each of these species. So that's why it is such a species-centric process. So I'll spend the next few slides just hitting some highlights of the working draft HCP, and obviously not going to cover the entire HCP tonight because it is quite a long document if you've had a chance to look at it, but I do want to highlight just a few things that we have looked at, particularly as it relates to those 3 species. And I'll start off by just giving a little overview of the entire HCP, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you can see there are 10 chapters, and one of those is references, and then currently there's 1 technical appendix. There may in the future become more technical appendices. And just the names of the chapters give you some indication of what is in the HCP. So there is, I kind of think about it in 3 chunks. There is the kind of the background information, the first 3 chapters, and I talked about covered activities already a little bit tonight. There's sort of the analysis portion of the HCP, which are the middle 3 chapters, the effects analysis, conservation strategy, and monitoring, which I'm going to go into more detail on now. And then there's the sort of implementation, how is this actually going to get done over time? So there's implementation and cost and funding that are described in separate chapters. And for the most part, all of these elements are required elements of any HCP. So if you picked up any HCP for any type of project anywhere in the country, you would see some aspect of many of these types of elements. So it is in some ways somewhat formulaic, although every HCP is different because every project is different. So there are certainly some unique features of this one, which I'll talk about in a little while. The other thing I want to point out is the name working draft is an intentional name. It very much is a working draft document. We have been, and I say we, it's really a, Oregon Department of State Lands and Oregon State University and with ICF's help, have been working with both federal agencies and ODF&W on the development of the HCP up until now, but it is certainly not done. There is still work to do. There are still some gaps in the document if you've taken a look at it. And the intention of providing this working draft out to the public now is so that we can get some input from you all on the sort of the contents of the HCP, what you're seeing in there, if there are any questions or if there's other things that need to be clarified, something that you think is being missed. It gives us an opportunity to get that input from you all and then to incorporate it as appropriate into a revised version of the HCP. So I wanted to point that out because working draft is really truly what it is. It is a work in progress, and so we appreciate you taking a look at it at this stage in the overall process. So a couple of key elements of the HCP, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about the effects analysis and the conservation strategy, and then walk through each of the covered species in a little bit more detail, just to give you some highlights on what you might see if you look at the draft. First of all, the effects analysis, and this is chapter 4 in the HCP. This is really I think one of the more fundamental parts of the HCP planning process. And what we're doing is really assessing the potential for covered activities to affect covered species. So that's the question, as I mentioned earlier, that's kind of the key question we're asking ourselves in the HCP is if these covered activities are implemented, what might that mean for these covered species? We described the potential effects on habitat for each of the covered species. And in many ways, the way the discussion is set up in the HCP, if you've taken a look at it, you'll see that it's sort of a potential worst case scenario. And the reason why we have it set up that way is that, ultimately, as I said, we're requesting permits for the activities for these 3 species at the end of the day. And so we want to make sure that the permit issuance, if it were to occur, is based on kind of again, the worst case scenario that might happen in the future. That way, we have the most certainty in our permits and in our planning process going over the long term. And then on the flip side of that, once we understand what the potential effects might be on covered species, we put together a conservation strategy that offsets those effects, or offsets the impact of the taking, which is the sort of the actual technical regulatory terminology. The conservation strategy establishes biological goals and objectives for each of the covered species. So these are the anticipated conservation outcomes for the covered species in the HCP. And the conservation strategy in this HCP includes 2 elements that help us get there. One is conservation measures that are designed to achieve those biological objectives. And then the second is conditions on covered activities designed to minimize effects on covered species. So when you open up chapter 5, the conservation strategy, you'll see it divided into really 2 sections, these conservation measures that are basically how we're going to achieve the biological objectives, and then conditions on covered activities that describe how activities will be implemented to minimize effects on the species. We also established a monitoring program in the HCP. There's actually a separate chapter. It's actually chapter 6 that talks about the monitoring program, but it's an important thing to note that over the course of the permit term, there will be ongoing monitoring to establish and determine whether or not the biological goals and objectives are in fact being achieved, and whether the research forest covered activities are being implemented in compliance with the HCP. So there will be ongoing monitoring and reporting related to that process. Now, one thing I'll note as I dive into the 3 covered species here is that when we sort of arrive at the HCP stage, you have to remember that OSU had already spent a lot of time working on their research proposal, which is available in various places online. And if you've been following along with this process, you've probably seen it at this stage. And it goes to great lengths to describe what the research forest is, what the various allocations are, what the intentions are behind the research forest, and how it will be implemented over time. And one of the things, just based on the design of the research forest on its own accord, and again, remember that image I showed you where you saw a large portion of the forest in conservation research watershed and other parts of the forest and other types of reserves. It's a very conservation heavy project proposal, if I were to think about it that way. And so when we get to the point where we're actually analyzing that in the HCP, we find that, in fact, there's a lot of conservation just built into the research design from the beginning. And so that's where we start our analysis in the HCP. We understand that there are going to be a large number of reserves in place, and we understand there's going to be riparian conservation areas in place, for example, and I'll talk about that more in a second here. But that's where we pick up our assessment in the HCP, and then we only add on additional conservation measures or additional conditions on covered activities where we feel it necessary to be in a very targeted way to provide some additional benefit. Now, I mentioned that each of the 3 covered species are treated, sort of separately in the HCP, and we do an analysis on each of them. For Oregon Coast coho, we actually do 3 different analyses for Oregon Coast coho. So there's 3 different independent populations of coho that occur on the Elliott. There's the 10-mile independent population, the lower Umpqua independent population, and the Coos independent population. And when we are requesting permits from National Marine Fisheries Service, we'll actually be asking for permits for each of those independent populations, and they'll be doing their analysis when they're determining whether or not to issue permits. They'll be doing their analysis at the independent population level. So we actually, if you've looked in the HCP, you'll see separate treatment for each of those independent populations. And when we begin that assessment process, we note right off the top, as I mentioned already, 66% of the permit area is in some form of reserves. And so there is a lot of conservation already built into the project. For fish, another notable part of that is that 86% of the non-fish bearing non-perennial streams are in either reserves or extensive treatments. And so when you're thinking about a large proportion of the Elliott in either reserve or extensive management areas, we see quite high, again, 86% of those non-fish bearing streams, including a lot of the upper watersheds, in some level of protection already. So again, that's where we pick up our assessment in the HCP. The conservation research design also, or rather the allotments, as I mentioned earlier, they also include riparian conservation areas. So, a designation of these essentially stream buffers based on stream type and size, et cetera, to focus on fish-bearing streams and non-fish-bearing streams, including reaches that have a high probability to deliver wood to fish-bearing streams. So when we're sort of like beginning our assessment in the HCP, we already know that there is a high degree of conservation and kind of long-term habitat development value built into these riparian conservation areas. And as we've been working with OSU and looking at those riparian conservation areas, they account for a fairly high degree, actually a very high degree of wood recruitment potential in each of those independent populations. And when we're thinking about what else might need to occur in the Elliott to continue to offset any potential effects that we might see on these covered species, you can imagine that it's going to be very targeted actions. And one of those is expanded riparian conservation areas in the Millicoma. So when you look at the conservation strategy chapter, you'll see that as one of the conservation measures. And that was to help kind of bolster the percent of wood recruitment expected in the Coos independent population. The Coos independent population overlaps almost entirely with the management research watershed. So that's why the wood recruitment number is a little bit lower, although still quite high. And so the addition of expanded riparian conservation areas in the Millicoma is an example of how we sort of add conservation value through the HCP to further minimize any potential effects there. And then you'll also see a description in that chapter about targeted riparian enhancement and in-stream habitat creation. So there is anticipated to be some management in some of the riparian conservation areas, particularly in those areas where they have been, at some point in the past, planted in plantations and are have a quite high density and could, stand some management in there. So there's targeted riparian enhancement planned in those areas. And then along with that, a portion of those trees that will be cut as part of that management would be installed as in-stream habitat creation projects. So you'll see a description of that in chapter 5 as well. And then of course, a good discussion on road management practices, both what will occur with any new roads that might be built, and then also how the existing road network, which is in relatively good shape already, will be managed so that we can minimize any potential future effects from sediment transfer. So again, very targeted conservation actions to continue to minimize and mitigate effects for coho. And then when we look at murrelets, starting again kind of at high level from the top, when we're looking at the areas on the Elliott that are currently known to be occupied, 84% of those areas are included in the reserves. And when you look at the areas that have some potential to be occupied based on habitat modeling that OSU has done, 90% of the potential marbled murrelet habitat is in reserve. So a really high proportion of the either occupied or potential marbled murrelet habitat are in reserves, and that's where we pick up our analysis. We note that there are quite a number of areas that are in reserves that are currently not habitat, but are likely to become habitat during our 80-year permit term. And you'll see in chapter 5 in the biological objectives for marbled murrelets, we actually include some habitat targets for the expectations about habitat development into the future. And that'll of course be monitored and reported on as time goes on. We do include some seasonal restrictions, kind of standard seasonal restrictions on activities occurring in occupied areas during the nesting season to minimize effects on nesting murrelets. And then as a condition on covered activities in chapter 5, you'll see a commitment for a high retention of pre-harvest density in extensive treatments in occupied habitat. So remember, the extensive treatments are kind of more in line with what you might think of as kind of ecological forestry or kind of multifaceted, multi-benefit management. And when those areas occur in occupied murrelet habitat, there is a commitment to retain a high percentage of the pre-harvest density. And then finally on northern spotted owls, similar kind of numbers here when you're looking at how the research allocations overlay with our current understanding of spotted owl locations and habitat in the Elliott. So when you're looking at nesting, roosting, and foraging habitat, 80% of those areas are in reserves. When you expand that to include the extensive treatments, 93% of the nesting, roosting, foraging habitat is in either reserves or extensive. And in this case, we've been using the Ray Davis's 2016 habitat model. That's where these numbers come from. It's really just an intersection of the research allocations and that modeling exercise that was done a few years ago. Half of the northern spotted owl core areas are completely within the conservation research watershed, so that's important to note. Similar to murrelets, there is a commitment to continue to manage for habitat development into the future, and there's in the same way that there are some future habitat commitments in the HCP for murrelets, there are future habitat commitments in the HCP for owls, and those are described in the biological objectives for northern spotted owls in chapter 5. Similarly, a high retention of pre-harvest density and extensive treatments in nesting, roosting, and foraging areas. Again, similar to the idea with marbled murrelets that I just described, and then also seasonal restrictions during the nesting season. One thing to point out that put it in kind of the work in progress category. And I mentioned earlier, this is a working draft. And so there are things that are continuing to evolve. And one of them is, I mentioned that, half of the northern spotted owl core areas are in the conservation research watershed. Well, the other half are in the management research watershed. And we're currently going through an exercise looking at the stand ages in those core areas and figuring out the right way to ensure that we can minimize effects on those core areas as we implement the research design into the future. And the intention is to try to maintain at least 50% habitat in those core areas at all times. And that would be a way to sort of allow those owls to persist in the management research watersheds while still allowing the research allocations and research treatments to occur that need to occur to implement the vision of the forest. So that's still a work in progress and isn't completely described in the HCP in the version that you're looking at on the website, but it's an example of part of the conservation strategy that continues to evolve as we go forward here. One thing I wanted to highlight here as I get towards a close is I think the unique nature of this HCP and the fact that it is a research forest and the fact that the research that will happen on the Elliott is certainly going to have a lot of benefits on the covered species over the long term. We are including research activities as part of the conservation strategy in this HCP, which is a unique aspect of this HCP. It's not common to include research activities as part of a conservation strategy in an HCP, really because it is sometimes difficult to quantify the benefit there. But because of the long-term nature of this HCP and the direct sort of connection to at least the 3 covered species that we're focused on, there has been an acknowledgement by everybody that's been involved, so far, that there is some real value and benefit there. So we have included it. You'll see those described briefly as conservation measures in Chapter 5. And we understand that it's really not just even the research on the Elliott itself, but it's the application of that research even beyond the Elliott across really the Northwest in general, where there will be the real benefit over the long term. And so there is interest in capturing that and capturing the value of that in the HCP. And so we are attempting to do that in our description of it in Chapter 5. So that's the end of sort of the technical content. And like I said earlier, we can go back and revisit any of those slides and talk about any of those things during the Q&A. Before I turn it back to Ali, I do want to just note that, I mentioned that we put this working draft out to get some initial input from you all on the content and make sure that if there's anything that is not clear, that we can get your questions and make sure that things are clear as this process moves forward. We are going to continue to work with both federal agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service and ODF&W to continue to revise and develop this HCP over the coming months. And then at some point in time, the HCP will need to be analyzed under the National Environmental Policy Act, under the NEPA process. So the issuance of the federal permits by the federal agencies is a federal action. So that's why it has to go through a NEPA analysis. That NEPA analysis will be led by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and will start later this year. The date on when that is set to start has not been set, and that's really up to the Fish and Wildlife Service to determine. We're working hard to get the HCP in good enough shape that NEPA process can begin. And I did want to highlight, the reason why I wanted to bring it up tonight is I did want to highlight that once that process begins, there will be some additional public involvement periods that are kind of required elements of any NEPA process. Initially, there will be a public scoping period, and then later in time, there will be a period when the public will get to review the public draft HCP and the public draft NEPA document. The timing of those 2 periods, of course, are not yet set either, but just wanted to flag it for you all so that as that comes near, you can be looking for messaging coming from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service along with everybody else about the timing of those key public engagement periods. So with that, Ali, I think I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you, Troy. Okay, we are just about at time for questions. So if folks can start raising their hands, if they've got a question to ask or a thought to share. If you're on the phone, again, it's *9 to raise your hand. We are going to call on folks in the order that I see people's hands raised. And then we'll ask you to say your name, where you're from, and an organization that you're representing. But before we start calling on folks, we do want the project team on the line tonight to introduce themselves. So I am going to ask our DSL and our OSU folks to turn on their cameras. And I am gonna start with the DSL team. Bill Ryan, will you go first? Bill was having some technical difficulties earlier tonight, so he was probably a bad choice for me to start with. Jeff, will you start while Bill, I think, is trying to.
Hi, everyone.
Trying to
I'm
join
Jeff
us.
Huntington. I'm a project advisor, an Elliott project advisor for the Department of State Lands and the Land Board, and working on all aspects of project management.
Thanks,
Sorry,
Jeff.
folks, Bill here. Can you hear me now, folks?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Sorry about that. Hi, Bill Ryan. I'm Deputy Director of Operations at the Department of State Lands, and so the real property program of DSL is under my purview.
Fantastic. Ryan Singleton, will you go next?
Yeah, Ryan Singleton, Forester, Department of State Lands.
Thank you. And then finally, Robert.
Hi, I'm Robert Underwood. I'm a project manager at the Department of State Lands.
Thanks, Robert. And now I'm going to go to the OSU team. Katie, will you start?
Sure, I'm Katie Kavanaugh, and I'm Associate Dean of Research, and done a lot of work on the Elliott State Forest Research proposal, along with a cast of 1,000. So I'm here to talk about that.
Thanks, Katie. Gordy?
Yeah, hi, this is Gordy Reeves. I formerly worked for the Forest Service and am now working with OSU on the riparian component of the Elliott.
Thank you. And then finally, Michael Collins. You probably thought you snuck on, but I see you. Will you introduce yourself?
Hi, all. Michael Collins. I'm Director of External Relations for the College of Forestry, Allie's counterpart for OSU.
Thanks, Michael. Did I miss any project folks?
You did. I think Paul Odenthal from OSU.
Oh,
was on.
Paul. Paul, I didn't see you at all, but will you please introduce yourself? And sorry about that.
Sure, and hopefully you can hear me okay. I've got not a great connection, but this is Paul Odenthal, Senior Associate Vice President for Administration at Oregon State.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, that is going to take us into questions. And I am not seeing anybody's hands up. So if you've got a question, now is a very good time, or if you've got a thought, now is a very good time, because you are.
Allie, I was gonna say, I think this is Troy. I'll take the presentation down so we can all see each other. But if people want to see a particular slide, I can easily put it back up. So
That's perfect. Thank you. Okay. Anybody with questions? Oh, Francis, I see you with your hand up. Go right ahead, Francis.
Thank you. Why is the coastal martin not included in the species protections?
yeah, thank you, Francis. So when we went through the original process of selecting the covered species, we did look pretty closely at coastal martin along with other species, frankly, and decided not to include coastal martin in as a covered species in the HCP, mainly because there are some, I guess, one of the things we have to do when we include it as a covered species, we have to make sure that our effects analysis can be thorough enough to really determine what potential effects are likely to occur from the covered activities. And then the flip side of that is that we have to be able to put together a conservation strategy that is detailed enough for us to definitely say that it is offsetting the effects to the species. Not having, a great picture. We know the martins are on the forest, but not having a great picture of where they are, how they're distributed, and how they're using the area. We felt it was going to be difficult to do that with that level of detail. And so they're not included as a covered species in the HCP. Now, that doesn't mean that they just get ignored. They certainly could be addressed, through the more general forest management planning process. And I would imagine, and Katie can probably speak to this a little bit as well, I would imagine that that's the kind of species that might be part of the research program going forward so that we can learn more about it, and it could potentially be added at some point in the future if that were appropriate.
Yeah, I could follow up about that a bit. And in fact, we have some coastal martin habitat research underway right now on parts of the southern coastal range and including parts of the Elliott. So it's definitely a species of interest to the college and to our collaborators. So.
And so it basically, it just means that you aren't allowed to do a take of coastal mountains. Is
That's
that
correct.
how that works?
That is
Yeah.
correct. Yep.
And so if any species in the future were to get listed, would they be treated like the coastal martin then, just with a no-take protocol?
Exactly right. Yeah. So if a new species gets listed that is not covered by the permits or the HCP or the permits, then they would be in a no-take scenario, just like the martin. And if it were decided at some point in the future that there is a benefit to add those species to the permit, whether it be martin or another species, there's a formal amendment process that we describe in the HCP for how that would happen. But it would be a formal process to actually add species and amend the HCP in the future.
Now, does that mean, like, for instance, martin, for instance, if it's a no-take protocol, do you have to survey for it before every activity to see if there's one there that you're going to disturb before you do, let's say, a timber sale?
It's a good question, and probably one better suited for the federal, for the Fish and Wildlife Service. I can't speak for them because I'm not a regulator, but I will say that in general, yes, except I think only so far as, if you know you're in suitable habitat for the species, if you know about that there's a den site, for example, in an area, then you would avoid impact to that particular den site. And that's the kind of thing that I think as more becomes known about the species in general, and specifically on the Elliott, there could be a better determination in the future about what does that actually mean. Right now, one of the challenges, frankly, that we would have if we were to include it in the HCP is we just don't know enough about it on the Elliott to really know how we would even go about minimizing the effects and then creating a conservation strategy around it. So that is one of the challenges.
But you will have to search for a den site if it's a potential habitat before you do an activity there.
To confirm that you're avoiding take, that's right.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Francis. Sue Craig, Sue's got her hand up, and I do want to note for everybody that you can also raise your hand on the screen. If you click reactions at the bottom, there's a little button there that says raise hand as well, or you can just wave at me. I'll see you either way. So Sue, go ahead.
I have several questions. So obviously this is doing the habitat conservation, et cetera, the way it's always been done. Is that correct? Oh shoot, I'm sorry. There's no way to do it differently.
I'll wait till Sue returns before I
am
get to her question.
On a meeting, I'll call you back. Sorry about that. In other words, the way that you're going about this research new way of setting up the Elliott Forest is starting off by doing it the way it's always been done. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure it makes sense to me, Sue. I mean, I guess maybe I'll start with another question and see if this helps. The way that the research forest is being set up at this point in time, I mean, it really is a research focused plan, right? So everything, all the allocations, the design, any of the activities that are occurring are really being done in order to implement the research program. So that is actually quite different, and others can weigh in on this. This is just my perspective, but I'd say that is quite different than the way the Elliott has been managed in the past, which is for a different, for the Common School Fund, for example. So I think this is a paradigm shift in terms of how the Elliott is being managed. Is that
Okay.
what you're asking?
And the way that that's being set up, is it being done by the whole university or only a small portion, like the forestry department or whatever? The
think
way that that is being set up.
Katie will have to weigh in on how that's working within the university. Yeah.
Well, I get Paul can chime in too a little bit on this, but I'm trying to understand your question. The university isn't doing the habitat conservation plan. So if it's that question, then it's Troy can answer it. But as far as the research plan goes, that is involved people from within the university and outside the university. So people, for example, from University of Oregon have weighed in on our research plan. People from Australia have weighed in on our research plan. People from Washington State. So we've had a lot of different people that have commented and looked at the research plan. So, and it's the College of Forestry and a host of probably another 20 or 30 individuals.
And how about other departments in the university? Are they being included? That was what was asked by the governor.
Yes, they are included, and they're included. They've always been included. We've had work and commentary with a lot of people from the Fish and Wildlife Department. We've had work and commentary from people that are in several departments in the university. And so there's always been an inclusive, open process for the whole university. And in fact, many of our faculty that are involved in this are dual faculty in other departments as well. So sometimes it's not quite evident at first, but.
And is the public being included in that at all?
In what form? They're included in the DSL advisory committee as the representative members of that. And plus we've held several of these public sessions as part of the research management planning process.
And Sue, this is Jeff Huntington from DSL. The Department of State Lands is the applicant for the Habitat Conservation Plan. And then once issued, if title is transferred to Oregon State University to run the research forest, the Habitat Conservation Plan would be transferred with the property. But right now it is the direction of the land board. The application will be made to the federal agencies from the Department of State Lands. And ultimately, I believe that the transfer is to the university as the university, not a particular college within the university.
Okay, so my other question is, I don't know quite how to put this. When you are looking at this from the broad perspective of how this is going to be run one way or another, there are species of animals that are not on the list of endangered species who are keystone in any given place, who are not protected at all right now. And you can go in and kill them anytime you want if you have a license, such as beavers. And what I'm asking is, considering that we are not getting the kind of water in Oregon that we used to get, and we have a huge cache in this particular forest of wonderful, wonderful things that we've had from the past. And if you cut down these trees, we're not going to have it anymore. What I'm thinking is, are you looking at a huge change that's going to happen in Oregon? I live in the Willamette Valley near Eugene, And I lived in Colorado for 26 years. And there are days here that I feel like I'm back in Colorado. It is so dry. And the little bit of rain that falls, and I go outside and it's all dry again. And for instance, if you have beavers, they will conserve this water and put it back into the ground in a way that is desperately needed throughout our state. And we're not doing that. We're just ignoring it right now. We've considered the Fish and Wildlife Commission to do something, and they don't. And I'm very concerned about, are you looking at the big picture for this entire process? And I know that this is probably not the meeting to ask you that, but I am very concerned about this. As somebody that lived in a place that got 14 inches of precipitation a year, and right now we have like 25 inches in our valley, where we normally get 40. And there's a big difference.
So Sue, maybe I can start and talk about, how we think about that with respect to the HCP, and then I suspect Katie or Paul or somebody could weigh in and talk about the forest management planning process, which is separate but related to what we're doing for the HCP, which is a broader look at things. So within the context of the HCP, we certainly, as I mentioned throughout the presentation, we certainly focus on those 3 species that we're seeking permits for. But we do, as it relates to your particular concern about water, for example, while a lot of the all the strategies in the HCP are really designed to benefit Oregon Coast Coho, you can imagine that all of those strategies really have more kind of a broader conservation benefit in the aquatic systems. So all of the riparian conservation areas that I mentioned, 86% of the upper watershed areas and reserves are extensive. Those all have sort of umbrella conservation benefits, I would say, across the board. We actually do spend some time in the HCP talking about beaver and the importance of beaver, actually because they create habitat for Oregon Coast Coho, which is one of the ancillary benefits. And so I do think in the HCP, even though it is a very focused document, we do touch on some of those broader themes that you're talking about, and the strategies that are described in both the research plan that OSU's put together and then some of the additions that we have included in the HCP, will have broader implications than just for those 3 species.
Okay.
Katie, Paul, or some others, do you want to say a few words about the forest management planning process, which will go beyond, of course, the 3 species that we're talking about here?
Yeah, and I also want to touch in, Sue brought up a really good point, and that's related to a change in climate that we're all very aware of, and it's a big part of our planning process and our research process. A lot of what we know about how forests are going to respond potentially to a changing climate and what those are is work that we do in our college all the time. And so we see the Elliott as an excellent place to study some of these changes and to see if the models or the way things are being predicted are playing out on the ground. So that's a really important part of a long-term plan. It's not 3 years of observations or 5 years of observations, but when you get up around 10 and 15 years, that's where you start to see the trends and the way things are headed. So we think that's a key part of the research done at the Elliott. And it's also part of a project we also work on and have been working on since the 1960s, which is the H.J. Andrews, which you probably are familiar with if you're in the Willamette Valley, and it's up the Mackenzie. But it's the long-term picture that we get that's so important to us. And so that transition phase is really one that's going to accelerate over time, not slow down. So we need to be creating these living laboratories. And one of the other components you mentioned, and that's part of the forest management plan, which will be the way that the research plan is actually implemented and put on the ground. And so that process is underway. And we'll also be addressing a lot of the more specific activities, such as habitat connectivity. So one of the things about many of the creatures that are out there, they need to get from point A to point B, and they don't all fly. So we want to make sure that we have the travel corridors in place, and that our reserve network goes up into the head walls and over into the next head wall. And so doing that, looking at the way things are placed and how that connectivity is improved is a big part of the assessment. And many of the conservation measures that we've put forward are really going to address multiple species. And we want to emphasize that as well, that there's early habitat species and there's late habitat species. And we really want to make sure that we're addressing all of them. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue, for the questions, and thanks, Katie. I am looking for more hands from folks. Does anybody else have questions? Oh, there we go. And oh, Francis Etherington has a question. Francis, will you go ahead and, yep, there we go, and unmute.
Oh, okay. Thank you for taking another question from me. Does this current draft or will a future draft quantify the take for spotted owls and merlets? And if it currently quantifies the take, I have to say I didn't notice it in there. What is the number of take for spotted owls and marble merlets? And I assume you don't quantify that for fish, I assume, but you do for the bird.
Yeah, it's more difficult for fish, but I'll get to that in a second. So for the birds, there's really two things that we're looking at with birds. There's effects on individuals, and then effects on habitat. So there's kind of two different things that we describe and that's in chapter 4 of the document. And the other thing that's important is that, really what we're doing in the HCP is we're sort of estimating what we think the effects are going to be based on best available information that we have. So, we understand that it's a little bit of an index of in terms of habitat quality, where the habitat is, where the birds are, they move around. And so it is a bit of a snapshot in time, but it is the best available information we have to make those estimates in the HCP. So that information is in chapter 4, and it sometimes is a little bit difficult to tease apart. You're right, but basically, we talk about. I think there's a section or two where we talk about the type of take that's likely to occur, which is what I just described, and then the amount of take, and it's quantified in acres. In some cases, and generally, it's quantified in acres. And then the other side of that is we say, well, there's this many acres that are likely to be lost. Generally, we're talking about, the intensive and sometimes the extensive harvest, depending. But we also then counter that by saying, but in the reserves and in many of the extensive areas, there is this commitment to allow this many acres of habitat to grow in over time. So we talk about both what's going to be lost and what's expected to be gained. And then in chapter 5, there is a section for each species that is the net benefits and or net effects and benefits to covered species. And that's really the kind of take home message for each of the species in terms of what we expect to occur over the course of the permit term. So the permits that are issued by the federal agencies, in this case by the Fish and Wildlife Service, it'll include, this many acres of we'll just talk about like spotted owls for a second. This many acres of nesting, roosting, and foraging habitat are expected to be lost over the 80-year permit term, and that'll be the limit basically. And so they will include that as part of their permit. So we do quantify that in the document. And then on fish, you mentioned fish. It is more difficult. We don't quantify number of fish that we think are going to be lost. We talk more in terms of habitat quality, that the various kind of in-stream aspects of habitat habitat that are likely to either be lost over time because of the way the forest may be managed, or gained over time based on the conservation actions. You will note, if you look at the description of the effects on coho in the HCP, because of the protective nature of the research allocations themselves, the reserves and the extensive areas, like I mentioned, and then the fact that there are riparian conservation areas, on all the fish-bearing streams and on a large number of the non-fish-bearing streams, it's pretty protective overall of fish to begin with. And so our analysis of coho then becomes, there's not a large, we're not asking for a large amount of take for coho. It is actually a very, very much, I would say take is very much minimized on coho just by the design of the research forest itself. So it is harder to quantify, take of coho in this case.
So to be clear, you actually don't name a number of spotted owls and how that will decrease over the 80 years, or quantify a take for spotted owls. Instead, you just talk about habitat acres is the only place you talk about take is acres.
In terms, sorry, were you done? I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's right.
Oh, in terms of number of spotted owls, the only analysis in there on number of spotted owls is there's a couple of tables in chapter 4 where we actually look at the known activity centers, northern spotted owl activity centers on the forest, and we do an assessment of and I mentioned this in the presentation, we do an assessment of the core areas and the home ranges of those activity centers. Now those activity centers, that data is, I think, 2016 or 17, so it's the best available that we have. And then what we don't do though is we don't commit to, creating a certain number of new owl sites in the future. For example, we commit to managing a certain amount of habitat in the future. And the main reason for that, particularly with birds, the main reason for that is that there are, of course, other factors beyond the control of, in this case, OSU or DSL, that might affect spotted owls, the main one in this case being barred owls. And so we don't tie the success or failure of the program over the course of time to the number of owls on the forest at any given time.
And the same for marble millet. You don't quantify take for millettes either.
Same, yeah, we quantify acres of occupied habitat that are likely to be lost based on best available information, but we don't quantify number of mirrolets, for example.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Troy. Thanks, Francis. Up next is Bob Salinger, and then after Bob, we're going to go to Mark Miller. But Bob, will you unmute and introduce yourself?
Sure, Bob Salinger, Portland Audubon. Thanks for the presentation tonight. Troy, I guess I'm curious about the temporal aspects. I understand that you don't count merlets, but there's a fairly significant amount of merlet habitat that's taken in this plan, both in intensive and in extensive watersheds. And there's this presumption that a lot of habitat's going to come online, but how do you deal with the temporal aspects of that? And also in terms of adaptive management, obviously some habitat is better for merlets than others. We know kind of what they look for on the landscape. Is there going to be any sort of temporal adjustment made in this plan, or in terms of when the cutting occurs versus when the new habitat comes online? And is there any expectation that at least there'll be some checking to make sure that when new habitat does come online, that it is occupied?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things in general, not just for mirrolets, but really across the board, that is important, a kind of important element of HCPs is there is a requirement as part of the kind of permit issuance process that the federal agencies go through. There is a requirement to demonstrate that our conservation is staying ahead of our impacts over the course of time. And that's really where the monitoring and reporting program comes in. So there is a temporal aspect, particularly for the two birds. There is a temporal aspect to, what habitat's on the landscape now versus what will be on the landscape at some point in the future, when some harvest occurs. And so there will have to be a continued account, kind of an ongoing accounting of habitat for each of the species, and a demonstration that the conservation is staying ahead of the impacts, or the amount of habitat that's growing in the reserves, as one way to think about that, is staying ahead of habitat that's being harvested in maybe an intensive area, for example. The other thing that's worth pointing out, I said this earlier when I said this is kind of an index, we're looking at the kind of the best available information. On mirrorlets in particular, in the HCP, and this gets back to that kind of like worst case scenario that I talked about in the presentation. In the HCP, we look at the areas that are set to be managed in, as intensive, and where that overlaps with the what we're currently calling occupied mirrorlet habitat. And OSU has already done some work in their proposal looking at those areas and making some determinations about, is it really occupied habitat, or is it habitat was characterized as occupied for some other reason? And so when the implementation of the HCP begins, there will be some initial accounting of, what is truly occupied and what is maybe not. And that will then, begin to count towards that ultimate take authorization in the plan. And then as time goes on, in order to demonstrate that new occupied areas are coming online, more in line with what we're describing as part of the biological objectives, there will need to be some monitoring of mirrorlets and owls, for that matter, into the future to demonstrate that there are these new occupied areas on the landscape. So that there will be annual reporting associated with that. So that'll be very clear to everybody what's happening. And then there's anticipated to be more in-depth reporting at kind of the 6-year and 12-year intervals. There'll be kind of a 6 and 12-year cycle of reporting over the course of time for a deeper dive into the trends that we're seeing on the forest, so we can make sure that we're staying ahead of impacts. Is that what you were getting at, Bob?
It is what I was getting at, Troy. I think one of our concerns is I don't think it's clear enough in the HCP at this point how that's going to manifest itself per se. And okay. I think there are risks in terms of certainly where we're doing extensive in known occupied habitat, also understanding better the intensive, the under 65, and whether that really is habitat or not, because they certainly could be in there if they're trees with old structure. A few big trees would be, you could have them in there. And so, I think really pinning down to make sure that we do stay ahead. And then the other thing I think in terms of mitigation that could be more robust in this plan is some of the other things that we've talked about in the stakeholder process, like strategies to reduce corvid predation where there's edges created, and so on and so forth. I think we have to keep an eye on the management watershed reserves pretty closely too, because they're odd shape, they have a lot of edges, and do they decline over time even if they stay intact? Due to the fact that they've been carved up and, successive generations become less likely to occupy them. So I think there's a lot to keep track of here. And I think it's possible that over time you could wind up with a deficit rather than the gain that we're talking about.
Thanks, Bob. That's helpful feedback. Yeah, we'll take a look at that as we go forward. To make it more clear for sure.
Thanks, Troy. Thanks, Bob. Mark Miller, you are up. Will you unmute and introduce yourself?
Yeah, this is Mark Miller with Trout Mountain Forestry in Corvallis. And I have a question about the riparian reserves. And I admit that I have not read through the draft HCP at this point, but you've talked about the riparian reserves being robust, and I expect somewhere in the analysis it says something about how much more robust they are than business as usual in terms of miles of stream protected or widths of buffers. Can you talk about how that is quantified?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start off, and then Gordy Reeves can come in behind me and provide some additional detail, because he's really the architect of that work. So we do in the HCP, we in our chapter 3, which is the covered activities chapter, we spend quite a bit of time talking about those riparian conservation areas, the purpose of them, the allocation of them, and like I said, they are the size of the riparian conservation area depends on stream type and you know, kind of orientation within the watershed. If it's a fish-bearing stream or a perennial non-fish or seasonal, for example. And then those that have potential, high potential to deliver wood into the fish-bearing streams are given special treatment as well. So it's a very kind of deliberate and targeted riparian conservation strategy, I would say, meant to, you know, truly improve habitat conditions for, in this case, coho, but really, I'd say fish species in general, the aquatic system in general. And there is a little bit of discussion about how this compares to other efforts. Although, you know, we don't go to great lengths in the HCP to compare this to other efforts or previous efforts on the Elliott, but there is some, I think, sort of general discussion in the HCP about how it compares to other, you know, kind of previous efforts or business as usual, if you will, on the forest. And Gordy can probably provide a little bit more detail on that as well, because he's been thinking about this for a while. And then in terms of how we quantify, you know, the riparian conservation area, the benefits from the riparian conservation areas, one of the ways, and I talked about this briefly on the slide, but one of the ways is Gordy and his team have done some modeling of the percent of wood recruitment expected from the riparian conservation areas into the fish-bearing streams, as again, a bit of an index for the quality of those riparian conservation areas and the long-term benefit that we're expecting on the covered fish, covered coho here. And so that is kind of an easy way, not easy, but I'll say easy because I didn't have to do all the modeling work. I'm sure it's quite complex, but kind of an easy way to describe the value of those riparian conservation areas into the aquatic system. And we actually set up our biological objectives in the HCP around the aquatic processes like wood recruitment and other aspects, which is a little different than what we did for the birds as we were talking about earlier. So Gordy, do you want to provide any additional detail on that question?
Yeah, Mark, I would like to add two things. One is our analysis is based on the site potential tree height, and that's where and with the focus on the ecological processes, not just wood recruitment, but water temperature, and there's a suite of others. And so we didn't start off with a fixed width. We didn't say 100 feet or 120 feet. What we started off with was, let's understand what the site potential tree height is in the Elliott, which is roughly 200 feet. Okay, and so that's where our buffer, that was the justification for the buffer width. And then we used a curve that was developed during the development of the Northwest Forest Plan that looked at the relationship between various ecological processes and the size of the riparian zone in a site potential tree height definition. And we use that to make our assessments. So when we look, you know, and what we're looking at here, when Troy showed the numbers of 99, 94, and 88, that the potential, how much of the potential wood delivery is conserved by those given buffers, by the buffer sizes, okay? So that's what you're looking at there. The other thing that is it's different in here, and it is how we define the streams. We define fish-bearing streams as having a gradient of up to 20%. Now this is compared to what is generally a 10% average that's used outside of in other areas. And so I think we've roughly increased the mileage of fish-bearing streams in the Elliott by roughly 60% or so. So our delineations are different. The other thing is we used a LiDAR-derived stream layer, and we identified about 3 times more streams than had been previously identified on the Elliott. So we took that into account. And then the final thing is we also considered wood delivery from via landslides and debris flows. And we were able to go through and identify which streams had the highest potential, which of these non-fish bearing streams had the highest potential to do that. And that's where we delineated the designated riparian areas for that purpose. Do you have any other questions, or do you need something clarified?
No, thank you very much. That's really helpful. It's really clear that those buffers are in fact very robust.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you, Gordy and Troy. Okay, I am not seeing any other hands. Oh, I am seeing Frances. Frances has her hand up. So Frances, you are up. Go ahead and unmute.
Oh, thank you again. I'm sorry to dominate the questions here, but I noticed on your map that outlined with a big green map at the beginning that outlined the habitat conservation planning area, that there was a large parcel in the northwest corner of the Elliott that was not included. Why is that? I believe it's above Dean Creek, just above the Dean Creek Elk Viewing area, adjacent to that.
I'm about to share that map again, just so we can all be looking at the same thing. Can you see that map now?
Yes, there's the Pargo up north, up there. You go, you're just there. Yes.
Sorry, there might be a little
not
lag.
the Board of Forestry. Yeah, not the Board of Forestry land, but a little further north, the green area.
This here.
That common school fund. There you go.
Yep. Yeah, Jeff or someone from DSL, do you want to weigh in on decisions related to that portion of the forest?
I'm not exactly sure what the history is on that particular piece, Francis, and unless Bill Ryan has or Ryan has something in it, I'm not exactly sure why it is not included in the scope and what the history is of that particular parcel. I'd be happy if we don't have an answer for you tonight, I'll be happy to get back to you on it. I just outdates my tenure here, so I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, Jeff, this is Bill Ryan. I can weigh in on that. That's the green parcel up there. That is, I believe, the East Hackney Ridge parcel, which at the time when we were putting together the not the plan area, but the permit area for the forest was not in DSL ownership or Common School Fund ownership. And then it has been, we basically had to purchase it back as a result of a lawsuit. And so the yellow area there are Board of Forestry lands, but East Hockey Ridge, we have not included it as part of the permit area at this point. That doesn't mean that may not happen in the future, but we're not there yet, and just that's the story behind that one. And then the yellow square, which we call the bullseye, those are Board of Forestry lands, as well as that sort of linear piece between those is also Board of Forestry. And so we did not include Board of Forestry lands within our HCP.
Yeah, the east, I'll just add, now that I know that that's the East Hackney Ridge parcel, that's something that I actually was just speaking with one of your colleagues today, Francis, on that. And it isn't out of the realm that at some point that could come in. It just wasn't, it was just not part of the plan because of the ownership status when this process started.
Thank you.
And maybe I'll just add there, I didn't go into great detail on this slide when we had it up before, but the area outlined in red is the permit area. The everything else shown here, which is sort of outlined in black in some cases, including the Board of Forestry lands, that's what we call part of the plan area. So when we're doing our analysis, we're actually doing it on the plan area. And when the NEPA process occurs in the future, the NEPA process will be completed on the entire plan area. That then makes it easier in the future to, kind of do exchanges, or if we, for example, if that area we wanted to add that into the HCP at some point in the future, it wouldn't be just like, it wouldn't just happen. There would be a process that would be in place to make sure that, it occurred in a way that benefited the HCP, overall HCP process. But you wouldn't have to amend the HCP in order to include that because it was already considered as part of the plan area. So that was there is a deliberate reason why we drew that kind of black boundary around the outer edge.
So we wouldn't be starting from scratch.
Correct.
Okay, so the Board of Forestry Lands will be in the forest management plan and within the planning area. The Board of Forestry Lands, the yellow stuff.
The Board of Forestry Lands they're in this plan area in case any future land exchanges occur with Department of State Lands, but they will not, and I'm pretty sure they will not be considered as part of the forest management plan for this process. They will be included in Oregon Department of Forestry's forest management planning process that they're doing along with their HCP.
And so the same with the East Hackey parcel would not be in the forest management plan.
I suspect not, but I would actually look to Katie or Jeff or Bill to answer that question.
At this point, I don't believe that we haven't had an explicit discussion about that, Francis. It's
Okay.
not contemplated to be part of the transfer of title, but you can tell that there's the difference between the planning and the planning area and the ownership boundaries are not always perfectly aligned, and the process of the forest management planning hasn't really started because a predicate for that was getting the proposal done in December and then making progress on the HCP. So more to come on that.
Okay, thank you.
Bob Salinger, go right ahead.
Yeah, just following up. I think Jeff was probably referring to me in terms of talking about this parcel. I do think it is, unique because it was part of the DSL lands, and obviously it was sold off early in the process, litigated, brought back into the state's ownership, but kind of missed this process. So I think that one of all the other parcels, all the parcels that are not part of this HCP, that one looms really large. So while I have everyone on the phone, today, I just want to flag that because I think that one is unique. It is one that the environmental community thinks of as part of this plan, whether it is or isn't. And I hope that as we do the Western Oregon plan, we'll really think of it in the context of kind of a contiguous Elliott State research forest and protect it accordingly. To me, it should be part of the reserve area, and understand there are complications because it wasn't part of the financial assessment for this, but I just want to keep flagging that one because it's something we have been bringing up, and it is really important to folks. It's different than those other holdings.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Bob. Okay.
You said it was, can I just ask one more quick question on that? You said it wasn't part of the plan transfer from DSL to OSU. And so if it's not part of the plan transfer and it's not Board of Forestry Lands, who manages that land then?
It is common school fund land.
So it would remain DSL managed land. I get it. Interesting.
Okay. I think we've hit everybody that had their hand up. And I am going to go ahead and bring us to a close. Troy, would you mind putting that very last slide up so I can do one more plug for the website and what's coming up?
Should be there now.
Perfect. So just wanted to remind everybody that the working draft of the HCP is available on our DSL website at oregon.gov/DSL. It's actually under current topics on the homepage right now. That'll click you right to it. If you have input, the email address to submit input to is elliottproject.dsl@oregon.gov. That address is on the website as well. And we're asking everybody to get us input by Monday, June 21st. And then again, we're going to make this video available on the website, and there's another information session coming up next Thursday, June 3rd. If you know folks who wanted to attend tonight and couldn't, if you'd like to see us again, we would welcome you to come back and join us next week. We don't mind. We like the company. Okay. And with that, I'm just going to say again, we greatly appreciate you all being here tonight. Thank you so much and enjoy your evenings.
Thanks all.
Bye.